What's up, comrades? Bienvenidos, compañeros. Welcome to this week's episode of Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. Max Ellbaum, in his excellent book called Revolution in the Air, about the new communist movement in the United States during the 60s and 70s, concluded that part of the failure of the new communist movement was a lack of connection between the older and younger generations of socialists and communists in the United States to build the movement, to provide a place of learning, of growth, of wisdom, of ways to share knowledge and practices that had been developed for generations in leftist organizations and mass movements. Well, on today's episode, we're going to be doing a number of things and hopefully taking some of Ellbaum's lessons to heart. On the show, I am very, very excited. I am very humbled to announce that we have an extraordinary documentary filmmaker on the show, an old school new communist movement activist, organizer, still organizing, still involved in the labor movement, someone I've looked up to for quite some time, the amazing Comrade Ann Lewis. Now, if you haven't heard of Ann Lewis's work before, I've provided links in the show notes for you to go find some of her films, her own video podcast series she's doing on the concentration camps around the U.S. border right now. But Ann has a wealth of experience and knowledge from her own practice, and she brings that in our discussion today on a work from the Italian scholar, American studies academic Alessandro Portelli in his book Biography of an Industrial Town, Terni, Italy, 1831 to 2014. This is an excellent episode that really, I would say, grounds itself in aspects of oral history, of cultural work, of aesthetics, of memory, tries to tie all these together to give a picture of this particular town that Portelli grew up in by way of my discussion with Ann on the book itself and her friendship with Portelli himself. This one is very, very special, and after almost 30 episodes of Red Library, I'm very happy to say this is one of my favorites. And I hope you'll agree at the end of the episode. All right, let's get right to it. In the meantime, you know what to do. Please support Red Library in any number of ways. Subscribe to the show on iTunes or any podcast catcher you use. Head over to Patreon. Throw us a few bucks if you'd like to support our work that way. Help us keep our guerrilla radio station strong and thriving, pumping out new content every single week. Like the show on Facebook. Shoot us an email. Let us know what you think. Find our Twitter handle also in the show notes if you'd like to follow us there. And last but not least, remember to give us a review on iTunes. Write us a couple of lines that helps potential new comrades find the show so we can keep spreading our listener base all over the globe. All right, y'all, we really hope you enjoyed this week's episode as much as we did making it, and we'll see you back here afterward. All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of Red Library. We have a very, very special guest with us today, and we are going to be talking about all sorts of things, oral history, working class history, and I think this is going to be a very, very special one. So I want to introduce our guest, the most excellent Comrade Ann Lewis. Hi, Ann. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Adam. This is fun. I hope it's fun. I hope it's fun for the people that listen as well as for me. So I was going to talk about, we had decided that we would talk about somebody named Alessandro Portelli. And Alessandro is somebody who I think is really important, but somebody that you might never read or, never really have access to, particularly the book that I'm interested in talking about, which is called Biography of an Industrial Town, Terni, Italy, 1831 to 2014.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. I know that whenever we first discussed doing this episode and recording together, which thank you so much for making the time and taking time out of your busy schedule to share this book and your own experience in history to be on the show. I had never heard of the author before or any of these books. So this is kind of exactly, I think, what the show is all about, to take works of theory, of history, of anything that's related to leftist politics, the history of that, the way we think about that now, and how do we pull some of the knowledge and information out of these texts and try to learn from it and take it as examples of what it means to be on the left today. Maybe before we dive into the content of the book, I was wondering if maybe you would just share with the listeners a little bit about your background, some of your own work as a documentary filmmaker, your history with the left, so everyone kind of knows a little bit about where you're coming into this discussion from.
I think I'll start with the last, which is my history with the left. So I was part of the new communist movement, really coming out of being part of, as a teenager, as a kid, civil rights, and then moving into the anti-Vietnam War. And I was I think in some ways kind of primed for really looking at alternatives to the system, which an awful lot of people were then. I think it was very common for people to participate in study groups and become involved with organization. And at that time, I didn't know very much about the labor movement, but I was very interested in the working class, and certainly my grandparents were clearly working class immigrant. And I was partly raised by my grandparents. So I was very interested in those things. And I think that I got involved in a film, which is fairly well known after working with other people for a while. And the film's Harlan County, U.S.A. And that plunged me into a very deep understanding of what the rank and file was like in the middle of a major labor struggle. And so I ended up relocating to Appalachia and lived there for 25 years and was very, very involved in class politics and in union politics, and also in the question of culture and how does culture play into that and how does media play into that. So it was kind of really good and really interesting. And then moved to Austin, once more involved with labor unions, also involved with socialist organizations as well. I think I've been kind of that direction of left. I think there are all kinds of different leftists in this country, and I'm very non-sectarian. I think in my approach, I really like the idea that there is that room for coalition, for working together, for solidarity, both with the progressive left and the labor left. So that's a little bit of my background.
I'm wondering, because I think this will relate to the ideas about oral history and the importance of telling the stories of working class movements, of labor struggle, of struggles for socialism, something beyond capitalism. For some of the listeners, we've done an episode before on Jane McAlevy's No Shortcuts Organizing for Power in the New Gilded Age, and we've talked a bit about the work around organizing social workers here in Central Texas for unions and for labor struggles. We've actually shown one of your films at an event that we helped put on, and I think that was A Strike and an Uprising. And I was curious if maybe you could talk just a little bit more about the importance of culture and media for the rank and file for labor movements and those sorts of struggles for, a sort of like non-sectarian kind of left, and how, I guess in your own work, how you see the importance of culture and media sort of helping us to understand sort of what it is to be on the left, maybe then, but also now as well.
Well, I think I want to maybe move more into Alessandro, because I think his approach is very more similar to mine. And I think I once put it pretty succinctly. I was, and I'm thinking on my feet now, or on my butt now. But I was being interviewed. At that time, I was working on community media, very grassroots, kind of cable type stuff. We called ourselves Mountain Community Television. That moved into Headwaters, which was it was video for one thing, at a time when people kind of looked down their noses at video. And I had a lot of skill at that point, so it was a little bit of a lie, but it was a half hour every single week, so some of the things were pretty awful and some of them were really, really good. I was talking to somebody and they said something about giving people a voice, and it's just not my attitude. I don't think when you do media, you're giving people a voice or allowing them to tell their stories or something like that. I think people have a voice already, and what's going on is that people are ignoring that voice, and sometimes that's because the voice isn't seen as a collective voice. I think this notion that we tell individual stories, or stories that are just kind of isolated from context and just expressing working people, what is it like to pluck a chicken kind of stuff, is is meaningful and important, and I'm not saying that's not a good thing to do. But I think unless we really try to understand the context and the way that people participate with each other in making history, we're kind of losing something. So it's not so much people telling stories as people telling a story, a complex story, which leads me to Alessandro. So I just wanted to quote from something right at the beginning of this book about Terni, and maybe we'll go back into Alessandro a little bit more. And this is what he says: "If one recounts a fact differently from how it happened, perhaps unconsciously one was actually aiming for that. It was a desire he had, and in which he also acted, probably. For it then did not materialize as historical fact because it was not achieved. Yet what he is saying is what he aimed at." And then he goes on to say, "Not all that is told in this book is true, but all was truly told. The tension between the telling of the event and the event of the telling underlines the process of memory as an active matrix of meanings. Remembering is a way of distancing oneself from facts as they are, a way of resisting the omnipotence of fact. As Walter Benjamin," so he begins quoting Walter Benjamin, writes, "an experienced event is confined to the sphere of experience, but a remembered event is infinite, because it's a key to all that happened before and after. What drew me to oral history is less its reliability than the frequency and rich meaning of its inventions, errors, breakaways from the materiality of facts." This is good stuff.
That's very good.
And this is not, this takes you very far, I think, into understanding history in a way that's not, somebody once said to me, "Oh, history, it's the history of war." And I remember studying. I never got a college education. So I ended up, because I began teaching, I had to get a degree, right? So I ended up passing AP exams, including history, which I thought I could do. And all I had to do was memorize dates of wars, and I could pass that was really what history was. So this is a very different understanding of what it is to tell a working people's history. And that's what Sandro is doing, and I think it's what I've tried to do in my films. Now, not all my films are history, but then everything is history, right? It happened yesterday. It's history, right? So everything in some way is processed through memory.
So I think this is an absolutely beautiful introduction into what we're going to talk about today with Portelli's book. I don't know if I mentioned this to you prior to us recording today, but one of the things that I think is probably one of the most common themes that we talk about on the show, especially lately, has to do with history and memory and the relation between the two, and thinking about the way that memory and history are related to for most of us. And I agree very much with what you said about, growing up, history was memorization of dates. But this idea that history is this active matrix of meanings is, to me, what is most fascinating about it. And I'm always reminded of something that Frederick Jameson once said about whenever we've lost a sort of connection to history and a sort of grounding of our meaning and subjectivity in history, we can no longer imagine the future. And his analysis was that is the nature of this era of capitalism that we're in, is the way that it proliferates through media and culture. Is one of its functions is precisely to take away this relation to history. I think we're kind of already answering this, but I'm curious, of all the things for us to talk about and share with people, what exactly is it about Portelli in this book, or a collection of books, and for your own work, that you think is most important for listeners to know about?
Well, I kind of want to take listeners a little bit through this book, because it was an expensive book, because it's academic, and I'm worried about people trying to buy it. But there's something that you just said that I just wanted to read you. I just have notes on this. I don't have quotes, but I have a quote at the end. He's comparing 1953 to 2004 in Terni, and it's right at the end of the book. So I'm going to be very fluid about this, which is, I think, the right way to approach most books, including Capital, by the way. Yeah. Much better to skip the first few chapters, right? Rather than reading them 50 times like I have and not progressing. Anyway, so around 1953, a German multinational took over the steel plant that was the basis of the town. From the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And Sandro quotes a song from 1953 when there was this big strike because they were very angry about this multinational taking over their town. And he says, the song goes, "Socialism is our hope. This is the history of working people. The great victory is near." This is 53. And then he goes on to say, well, in 2004, workers were doing the same things. They were blocking roads. They were picketing. They were physically attacking managers occasionally. But the language had changed, and that the only hope at that point was not being pushed back into the past. And he goes on, this is a quote. He said, "What had faded away was the future." It is chilling, isn't it? And I think that's an important understanding, whatever. I think it has reference to what you were talking about, right?
That is absolutely just chilling and raises goosebumps on the back of my neck, because that quote captures so much of what feels like my own deeply personal relationship is to politics and history and memory, and thinking about this sort of, I don't know if I would say gap or what seems like an absence for a lot of us today, especially for younger folks, as well as I do, that maybe are just getting into leftist politics for the first time over the last year or so with the election of Trump in the U.S. And one of the things that I keep coming back to is, what exactly are we coming into this with in terms of history? And if we don't have much of that, or our connection to that has been severed in any kind of meaningful way, how does that impact what we think the future could be, or how we imagine the future? And sometimes I think a lot about what Enzo Traverso calls left-wing melancholia, how we get very almost like libidinally attached to this idea of the past, precisely because we don't know how to imagine a future anymore that could realistically posit some sort of way to overcome capitalism, ecological destruction, and collapse, and all these other things. So just to me, I think that quote, I guess in many ways, is so perfectly in alignment with what everything else we've been really covering on the show. And so I didn't expect it, but I just think it's absolutely beautiful and a really sort of amazing, I guess, like felicitous sort of thing to share, because that sort of encapsulates the spirit of what the show is, I think, really trying to explore, especially for a lot of us who, are definitely of the younger generations, who are trying to make sense of what is this history and this tradition that we're a part of, and where is it going, and how do we help take it someplace that is radical and productive and revolutionary without being stuck in the past in some way. So I appreciate you sharing that, and I guess wherever you want to go next sounds great to me. So,
well, I think I want to go back to the beginning of the book and not to the introduction again. So this is a different look at, I think it does have relevance in terms of how do we look at history, because in a way, the way to look at history is not just from books, but from going and talking to folks now, right? And seeing what they think the future is. That's a lot of the job of socialists, right? Is you go talk to people. I mean, I don't know very many socialist hermits. I mean, it's kind of, and particularly talking to people who are workers. And there's a lovely quote from a seamstress that he kind of begins with, and he says, "Better than a novel, this life of mine." There is a sense that people have full lives in this society. And we can get really morose about how horrible things are. But people do have full lives, and they're proud of the things that they've done. And and accomplished. And there is a certain joy in life, period, I think. I mean, maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but, there are times when you don't feel that. But I think that's sometimes overly intellectualizing what's going on. So he begins this history of this town in 1831. This is really early, right? And he begins from a class perspective right from the get-go. He's not describing this town, and he's describing it through voices and through text and through historical sources. But one of the things that he talks about, and through people remembering their own family members, primarily. So he talks about a 90-year-old woman who goes to masses for the dead at 5 a.m. every morning, drags herself to these in 1830s in order to get paid an absolute pittance. So she's a proxy mourner for rich people's funerals is her job. For me, that's so interesting, and it's so against what we think of as the piety of peasants or of working people or people that are uneducated. We think they're just foils for the church. But that wasn't true in Italy. And it's very interesting for me. There was an anarchist federation pretty early on in Terni. And one of the things they said was, in case of, this is written text that he's uncovered, of course, in case of my decease, I do not want the priest to interfere with my funeral, because I want my comrades to perform all that the anarchist feeling requires on such an occasion. No priests and no crosses. And this is another quote from there. You think you're going to heaven and instead you go under the earth. I think we might find similar attitudes if we really look at what people in this country, rural people that were put into a class-based structure in towns would think of the rich and would think of the representatives of the rich, be they a Catholic priest or a Methodist minister. And it wasn't monolithically devout. There's a certain knowledge that comes from the experience of class.
So I'm curious, with so much of our conversations today about whether it's rural areas or flyover country, I think the general stereotype is that it is this sort of monolithic block of people who are deeply reactionary in so many ways. And this strikes me as being just a completely a different way to think about it, and a different way to ground a sort of analysis of what the actual lived experience of those people are in a relationship of class and a structure of class. I'm curious, how would you compare this to maybe what you see as how we talk about rural areas and the people that live there now, and how this provides a corrective to that, or what sort of corrective could it provide?
I do think that we have to stop. I don't know how to put it. My experience is Appalachian, so that's a very complex society. That's a rural industrial workforce. So in terms of population density, in terms of employment, we're in a totally industrial, exploitive workforce. But in terms of where people live and access to the amenities of cities, we're rural. So you really can't think of it that way. I think that I hope that people become a little less judgmental about rural people. They certainly are driving the country to the right. I mean, there's no question about that. Although that could change and has changed. I mean, there have been very strong progressive rural movements. There have been even very strong anti-racist movements in rural. There was a wonderful story about rubber workers in the Gulf Coast, where black and white folks really got together and changed the circumstances of their lives. And it was a very reactionary area. So I think that there are stories that contradict a lot of things, particularly when you begin looking at black rural populations or Latino rural populations. You really can't look at the South, rural South even, as a monolith anymore. I'd suggest people read Hammer and Hoe. I just think those divisions between city and country are much more fluid than people think. Yeah, that's kind of what I have to say. What I love here is that you're beginning to look at a working class that has agency and understanding because of their situation. And this is where I think Alessandro as a human being is somebody who is deeply in relationship to the people that he talks with. And that's probably something that we can learn from him, just in his style of being with people. So one of his stories in this book about Harlan County, which is, again, this rural place with an industrial workforce, is sitting down with a black woman who says, I don't trust you. And he says, well, tell me why you don't trust me, rather than assuming, well, I'm a I'm an Italian, I'm a white man, I'm, blah, 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 blah. And she then proceeds to tell him exactly why she doesn't trust him for the next 3 hours, which is the most amazing interview, oral history interview about her life and the reasons why she wouldn't trust a white man, both in terms of gender and race, and a profound understanding of those things. So a lot of it, I think, is in the way we approach people. And Alessandro never calls it an interview. He really calls it a conversation. So he doesn't interview people in our understanding of what an interview is.
I'm also really curious because as someone with a social work background, I always tell people that part of what you're trained in is communication and how to have conversations and dialogues with people in a way that is the most accepting, sort of open, trustworthy way possible. Let's say that there are some, younger leftists like myself and people younger than me listening to this who maybe find it really hard to talk to people. And I agree. I think you're right that whenever I think about what is a good socialist or anyone who's in the left in any sort of way, it's like, well, hopefully you're talking to people and that's sort of your bread and butter. I'm wondering what you think just from this book or, Portelli in general, your own experiences, just in some simple way, like what would be some good lessons or things that younger leftists could learn about how to talk to people in a way that could sort of capture this kind of spirit?
Well, I think a lot of the time it's a question of why do you want to talk to people? Sometimes it's a missionary spirit, and that's probably the worst of it. I'm much like missionaries. But, you run into a lot of people like that. If I ever hear the line after I've talked about something again, which is, thank you for sharing, I am going to spit in the person's face, I swear. Takes you into this relationship which is so phony, I think. We're human beings. We communicate with each other. We don't share with each other. That smacks of some kind of, it bothers me deeply for some reason. I just heard it. But, it does truly bother me, and I'm sure it's well-intentioned and everything. I think a lot of the things that bother me are very well-intentioned. I think maybe I'm getting old and crotchety. I don't know. I think I may be getting more crotchety towards my fellow white people than I used to be. Is that fair? I don't know.
I think that's very fair. I actually really appreciate that sort of spirit and some of those things that you just shared because they're very rarely, if ever, approached with a critical eye. And that underlying missionary zeal is something that I think is really endemic and isn't really reflected on in a critical way. One of the things that I'm really interested in, I feel like I see a lot, is what I call this sort of messianic impulse. And a lot of people on the left right now, especially as conditions become more dire. And I think finding some way to be critical of that and try to subvert that tendency in people, I think is really important, especially for us and our comrades to think about the way that comes off, and it does communicate things to people. And I think that's exactly what you pick up on, and I appreciate you sharing that, actually. So, I will take as much of your crotchiness as you want to provide on this show.
I guess what I'm saying is that a lot of the time people on the left are talking to people in order to recruit them to whatever organization they're a part of. And I'm guilty there too. We all are, and I certainly do it trying to get people to join a union and so forth. I also believe very strongly in self-organization and self-determination. And so I don't want to be in a position of going in from a superior position if I can possibly help it. And I think there's a really simple way to do this. One is to be genuinely interested in whatever the other person has to say, not so much in what you have to say. Be willing to ask some really idiotic questions. Not worrying about so much how you look, but trying to understand what's going on there. And perhaps, just having a certain level of humility and feeling like it's a very great privilege to talk to other people. That there are reasons why people don't trust you, and a lot of times get back to Alessandro's story, a lot of times that lack of trust is very revealing, and can be listened to, and you can learn a great deal from it. It's not that things are nice in this book. It's like it also talks about women a great deal, but it talks about guys, sitting around out in the town and telling stories and getting drunk and then fighting. And it's good, visceral stuff, I mean, people say things like, "Give me back my job or I'll turn you inside out like a sock." I mean, it's very visceral, and sometimes it's not so much directed at managers, but at each other. There was another one that I loved. This is about the coming of fascism. Okay, so Italy became fascist, of course. It's where the name comes from. And there were basically two. When you go to a town in Italy, you can see two lists of names. One list of people that died in the Second World War, really fighting for fascism with Mussolini. And then the second group of names is the resistance fighters. So they get rid of Mussolini, then they get invaded by the Nazis, and they have to fight the Nazis. And then they end up fighting the Allies around things like NATO. So it's like, a whole series of struggles. One of the sayings that came out of fascism was he'd stand on tiptoe to slap somebody's face.
I might have to use that myself.
Isn't that a great line? But the other thing is they couldn't do very much under fascism. So what they did was they read, and we're talking about workers, factory workers all through this. And what did they read? Well, they read The Grapes of Wrath, and they read The Iron Heel by Jack London. And everybody thinks of Jack London as being this writer who it's all about Alaska and the gold rush, and nobody really reads books like The Iron Heel, which is a study of fascism. So it's very interesting the kinds of things that they read, and that they're actually interested in reading books translated into Italian from English, from American experience. They form, out of Terni, they form something that they call the Gramsci Brigade, which is the resistance. And they basically take to the mountains and begin attacking the Nazis. And there's interesting stuff in the book about that whole process of becoming a resistance fighter. But there's also an understanding that Sandro brings to that. And I'm just going to read Sandro's words, not what people are saying, because he interweaves himself. The book is a conversation between all kinds of people in the town, but it's also his understanding of what they're saying, which I think is really very valuable. Makes it very different from reading Studs Terkel or reading Howard Zinn, even that interweaving of different things. It also makes it quite dense. This is Alessandro talking. That resistance was a war no matter how just, involves actions and feelings. Hatred, revenge, anger. Hard to countenance in a time of peace and hard to reconcile with the ideals of democracy and civilized society for which partisans were fighting, dying, and killing in the first place. He's so mature in his understanding of politics. So then the question becomes, if you do have a revolution, how do you then move or throw the Nazis out, or which happened in Italy, of course? How do you then go back, in a way, to notions of forming a society that's based around the working class? How do you address the economy, which has been a very, very hard thing, I think, for people to imagine. Oh, there's this wonderful line about what it's like to work in a factory. The factory work becomes worse, horrible kind of timekeeper, American kind of style or Japanese style through this country. And one of the workers says, "You vomited your soul on those machines." Terni's workers had fought in the resistance, rebuilt the town, conquered the city government. They thought the town belonged to them. And then there's the death of a young worker, which he writes a whole essay about, which is never punished. And that becomes the humiliation the powerless. And the fight for jobs becomes also a fight for dignity and pride.
Avanti o popolo, alla riscossa, bandiera rossa, bandiera rossa. Avanti o popolo, alla riscossa, bandiera rossa, trionferà. Bandiera rossa la trionferà, bandiera rossa la trionferà, bandiera rossa la trionferà, e viva il comunismo della libertà. Degli sfruttati, l'immensa schiera, la pura innalzi, rossa bandiera. O proletari, alla riscossa, bandiera rossa, trionferà. Bandiera rossa la trionferà, bandiera rossa la trionferà, bandiera rossa la trionferà, il frutto del lavoro a chi lavora andrà. Se cambia il mare dalla miniera, dall'officina.
Here's somebody else talking. The boss, you saw him everywhere. He was in the air. He made his way into workers' minds too. So you get this very complex understanding of how people are thinking. And I think we haven't done that.
I actually think that's such a fascinating thing to talk about. And I will say that the sort of visceralness and the poeticism and the nuance of his understanding, even just hearing some of these, it actually drives that home. I'm curious, why do you think we haven't been able to have that same sort of understanding that Portelli has very clearly from just even taking certain passages from this book?
I mean, I have to say, I think we don't do the cultural work that needs to be done. We're busy getting sound bites and doing little YouTube deals, which is one thing that I really like about your format, is that there's some length there. Now, will people listen to, how long would people listen to something? I don't know. But that impacts, how do we listen to folks when we go talk to them? How long do we intend to spend listening to them? I mean, I don't ever set up an interview when I'm doing an interview with someone for less than a couple of hours, just because I find that, sometimes they say everything they have to say in the first 10 minutes, but that's not always the case. Sometimes you can really kind of relax and kind of go deeper into things with them. And they may have questions for you too. And those questions can be very revealing. So I believe in fairly long conversations, and that takes work, and it takes focus, and it takes a certain level of, I don't know how to quite describe it. It takes a different level of interest on the part of the person that's going to do that work.
I think that's a really important thing, to connect up the dots between this sort of relational work and spending the time and investing the time and being very genuinely curious about however many layers of that person's experience you're going to have the potential to encounter. And it makes me think a lot about how these larger conditions, cultural conditions, material conditions of capitalism, which constrain time more and more. We end up feeling that we need to produce at higher and higher rates in our activist organizing work, as if we were on the factory line. And I think, to me, it's always strikes me that those sorts of material relations are a huge part of what we're all taking up in our day-to-day lives. And sometimes we don't realize how much those things influence even just the way that we relate to each other. I guess I'm also wondering, to me, it feels that there's a connection between this sort of relational aspect of politics as we're talking about them and the cultural work. Would you also say that for you, that's part of the cultural work, is this way that we relate to each other, whether it's through discussion or even just comrades day to day and organizing, or on the shop floor or in the office, wherever it might be?
Well, I think that, we're going back into this question of how do you recruit somebody into an organization that you care about, right? And because everybody is trying to get certain kinds of folks to join those organizations, right? I don't work in a factory. I work at UT. It is kind of a factory, but it's like, and I'm part of a wonderful union that's predominantly, like a lot of public sector unions, predominantly women and predominantly African American and Latinx. And so for me, this whole question of, is that the right thing to be doing? Is it right to be trying to recruit African Americans or Latinas into your socialist organization? What would you be doing with these people? That's a very interesting question. And then of course, what is your socialist organization doing? It becomes another question. And what's the nature of that collective? And so you have to, I think, examine these things. The new communist movement believed that you recruited through struggle, that you went and you were part of the struggle, and that is how you recruited people, and you were doing it also in a very true way of being with people and fighting for their issues. So you didn't just go out and try to talk to somebody who wasn't in motion, and try to create motion where there was none, I'm almost at the point where even with unions, which is a mass organization after all, I'm not that interested in trying to convince somebody to join a union. It's much more for me, let's talk about what could we do together, and, doing that in the context of something else. Is that kind of making sense?
Actually, yeah, it is. And I'm really glad you brought up sort of your own experience in the new communist movement with this, because I was actually very curious to hear your thoughts about what lessons, looking back now, you take from that in the approach of going and joining in the struggles of people, and that's your vehicle to recruit. And it seems to me that being part of the left now, whatever that is, however we want to define the parameters of that, it strikes me that this question of recruitment and what really are our intentions, these are important questions to ask, and I think ones that I don't hear being asked a lot. And I think I struggle with that every day myself too, to think about what is the role of us talking to people who aren't already in motion, as you put it, and is there a place for that? Is it more about looking at who is with us, or who shows up of their own accord and saying, what do we do together? I don't know. I think I'm trying to figure that out. And it's at least refreshing to hear your thoughts on this, because to me, these are absolutely pressing questions of organization, of structure, of relating to each other, and how we think about, what is our role as individuals in all of this, and how do we live in some way by these politics and organize. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I don't have very good answers, but it's good to at least feel like we're talking about them and putting them out there, and hopefully others will listen to this episode and will maybe ask those questions themselves, and of those, the comrades around them, whatever that looks like. So I really appreciate that. I guess I know that from what maybe I was aware of prior to doing this episode, that you've actually interviewed Portelli in Italy, right? You've gone and traveled to Italy to talk with him?
First of all, this does have a relationship to cultural work, which is really, where I know more about talking to people, because that's what I do. Well, what documentary filmmakers do, right? They also go to places and film events and stuff, but they also, a lot of it is talking with people. And so, again, this question of motivation, and are we building a film together, or am I exploiting you and using your words to make a product that I can then sell? So those questions of ethics and motivation are a constant thing for doc filmmakers, and so it's kind of familiar turf. And I kept hearing that term that I was using of recruitment. That's like, I don't know if I like that. That sounds kind of like military or something, but building an organization with other people, or building a movement with other people, what do I bring people into when I ask them to join a union? Well, I hope I bring them into the labor movement as well as that specific organization. And that specific organization is a matter of its members and how those people work together in a situation. So one of the famous lines about unions is, that the first reason for a union is to eliminate competition between workers. It's a very interesting concept, but it changes your relationship at work, and that is something that people really want and need, just for a level of support and solidarity. The new communist movement. So I think I haven't probably examined it enough. I'm thinking about it a little bit more because my partner, Jim Branson, had deeper involvement in that new communist movement for many, many years. And I was part of it for 6 years or something like that. That's not very long. I was always very interested in mass movement and maybe a little bit more reluctant to commit. I think what I learned is the importance of a collective. I mean, the importance of having comrades. The negative things that I learned, and I don't want to be as negative as a lot of people are, is sectarianism really doesn't work very well. We spent an awful lot of time fighting about what was going on in Angola or something like that, and whether we had the right line, it was really crap. That was pretty rough. And then I think, I may have slightly anarchistic tendencies. There was a level in that new communist movement of telling people what to do a little bit too much, and a kind of an authoritarian leadership model that I don't think is healthy. And of course it had all of the problems of the society, every organization that we create does. The problems of sex and gender and class, and even class, the money, and just goes on and on, race. So you can't really escape those things. No matter how hard you try, you can try to function on an internal level to try to change those patterns of behavior, but they're pretty ingrained, and they do come out, and they end up destroying organizations. I mean, that's certainly modern story, with ISO, which is a sad thing for me. It's not that I agree with the ISO line, or what used to be the ISO line, but they were a good organization. They were helpful. They were constructive. They educated a lot of people. I had friends in ISO, not to be overly defensive of their political line, but so that's kind of where I'm at on that. Do you want to hear my favorite piece of Portelli? This is my favorite. This is absolutely the most incredible line. So this is part of this idea of organizing and struggle, because I think there are two things you have to do. You have to be willing to have a conversation. You have to be willing to be transparent about your own motivation. But I think the other thing is the best place to meet people and to talk to people is not necessarily in the workplace, because our workplaces tend to be class-based, but in demonstrations, picket lines, so forth and so on. That's where you really get to talk to people. So you get to talk to people by putting your body on the line. And you always have a choice, of course. You can just be there and hold a sign, or you can begin talking to the people around you, and that's always quite interesting, So Sandro this is 1984, they abolished the cost of living allowance in Italy. And Italy at that point was very heavily unionized. And so rank and file factory councils call a march, and 700,000 people show up, and about 300,000 of those people are from Terni in the north of Italy. And they go to Rome to march. And he runs into these three women in the march from the factory council, and they begin talking about abortion. This is a Catholic country, right? And the three women say basically, well, one woman in particular says, well, I wouldn't do that, but I think that every woman has a right to reproductive choice. And the other women, one of the women has had an abortion and talks about it. And so they talk about this thing as they're marching in this big workers' march. And the question comes up about religion. And this woman says, I'm not religious. She says, if we want to believe in something, let's. but he, as in God, he, ought to do things right. Each is religious in his own way. You ought to ask poor Christ who was hanged. And this is Sandra talking about this. And the aptly named, her name is Magdalene, brings it all home with the supreme Uchronia. How different history would have been if God had been a working class woman. And this is what she says. This is a quote. If I had been God, if I'd been the Father, I wouldn't have let him die like that hanging on that cross. So that's, I think, what Sandro is about. And that's the kind of thing that you can get, I think, if you really, and that I could think about for a very long time, and I think that's the nature of oral history, is that very deep understanding of human imagination and human desire that I can't re-express that because it's there in the quote.
That is an absolutely astonishing quote. And thinking about this, I guess the sort of power of those words, and thinking about the deep desire and imagination that is really what oral histories capture. I do think a lot about what we miss whenever we don't engage with oral histories now, and how much maybe we do miss the importance of that realm of desire and imagination, and thinking about politics, whatever that looks like and however we engage in that. I'm wondering, for, let's say, those of us in the States right now, I can think of very few times whenever there have been opportunities to walk with folks, walk with other comrades and workers along the picket lines to hold those signs. And I wonder if there's a way that a lot of us are very disconnected from the sort of the potential of that, or the possibility of this engagement with this sort of desire and imagination. I guess I'm wondering if maybe it's harder to do that now with the way that the labor movement has changed, in the States at least, the way that we think about unions now, or maybe the lack of awareness about them or engagement with them. I think it's something like 10-11% of workers in the States now are unionized, and maybe we just don't have as many opportunities. I don't know. I'm curious what you think about that.
I think we have various movements. We have the labor movement. We have a generally progressive left that does a fair amount of demonstrating. You could go to the Capitol just about once a month and raise a fist in the air, right?
That's true.
I personally would recommend it. I know a lot of people think it's a horrible waste of time. The reason they think it's a horrible waste of time is nobody's at the Capitol on a Saturday. And we go and demonstrate, and who are we demonstrating to? And I think that's a lack of understanding about the purpose of a demonstration, which is not for those people there, but not for the enemy, but for ourselves, right? So I think that's a good idea. I really do, just to get a sense of where the movement is at and to get a sense of who's participating. So I just did this series about the border, and it came out of this feeling that I just can't stand it anymore. I'm supposed to be a doc filmmaker. I'm sitting a couple of 100 miles away from concentration camps, if we don't count the local prisons. But, in terms of refugees being imprisoned, I got to get my ass down there and do some media, which is what I do. That's really my ability to affect change, aside from just being a person. So I went down, and what I decided was not to talk to people, not to talk to refugees, and instead to talk to radical women that I knew who could give me those stories somewhat processed. That was a very deliberate decision, and I'm still trying to figure out why. I think it was the right decision, but I'm trying to figure out why I made that decision, because generally you go in and I think my approach is different in that I don't go into other people's communities without them. I don't like the idea of being a media maker without some context there. Sandra writes about Terni because he grew up in Terni. It's very important to have some contextual basis in the place you're going. So if you're going to the border because you can't stand yourself if you don't go, then do you really have the right to go interviewing refugees? Probably not. So you have to kind of develop a sense of where your place is.
This actually does bring up something I wanted to ask you about with Portelli and actually about Terni, and I was curious what his connection was to this specific town. And I'm curious, in this particular book that we're talking about, is there also a way that the town itself almost is a character in the book? Because it seems that there's this importance about being grounded in the context, the way that people relate to each other based on the sort of grounding in this town itself. So yeah, I was just curious if there's a way that focusing on the specific area almost has a sort of quality of its own that you would attribute to a character in the book.
I actually don't think so, because I think places are contextual. I mean, everybody's understanding of that place, of course, is somewhat different depending on when they were born. The town changes. I mean, I suppose characters change too, but it changes as much from external force as internal force. You know, characters are kind of, people change, but they don't change. They can change pretty radically. I'm trying to think about that. I guess I think that my answer would be no, that the town is not a character. I can't anthropomorphize a town. A town is its people and its time and its relationship to the surrounding towns and the country it's in, and it's a collective of sorts, but it's a place.
Yeah, that's helpful to think about too, because whenever I think about organizing work and almost the necessity to organize or to focus on communities that you're a part of or places that you have this sort of grounding in, I was actually talking with a good comrade about this pretty recently, actually, about what do we do whenever we feel that we don't have a community that we're a part of, or we feel very disconnected from some sort of bigger struggle that feels that we can identify with it. And I wonder a lot these days, we were talking about sectarianism earlier, how much the ongoing appeal, at least for some people, of more sectarian groups is because there's not really much else you feel that you're actively a part of. You know, to me, I think I've grown more critical with that over especially the last couple of years, of saying, okay, yes, we can go join these groups, but how much is this sort of retreating back from the sort of challenges of organizing and being grounded in a place of our own? So I was curious that, you know, with reading Portelli and this idea of oral history, is there something that we can take from that to maybe help us change our own idea about where we're organizing and what our communities are, and expanding our way of thinking about that, maybe to help motivate us to actually start being more involved and more grounded in the communities that, you know, we are a part of.
Okay, so first of all, Portelli also does a book about Harlan County, so, you know. So he doesn't limit himself to the places where he grew up or lived, even nationally, right? He comes all the way. And so he identifies as a member of a kind of international working class, and so that broadens this whole thing out in a way that's really wonderful. He definitely develops people that become his access points to other places, and that, I think, is important, you know, that you're not going into somebody else's community without them along. But your question is really one of the basic ones, I think, about, so you have a group, a collective, you have a cadre organization, as we would call it, right? Which I have some, it's a little squirmy, but there it is. Okay, so you have that, and then you have mass movement. And I mean, my answer is that they don't rule each other out, that they're, you know, that you should be part of both, that because you're a part of a small group or a collective doesn't mean that you're not, as a socialist or as a communist or as a leftist, absolutely required to be part of a mass movement, of the mass movement. You know, it's Maoism, right? From the masses, you know? I mean, you have to be. You have to be in some kind of political context. And that's what I think is lacking. I don't think it's our notion of history that's lacking. I think it's our lack of understanding that we have to be rooted in some political context with masses of people. And those things are there, I think. They may not be in your immediate vicinity, or it may not be in your specific workplace. But I think there's a lot of interesting things going on. And I mean, I'm very encouraged by things like the West Virginia teachers strike, which I'm thinking about a place where I'm not living, but that I have real relationship to. And how does that happen? And what would my role be if I was there, and how would I integrate myself into that struggle? Because I would want to. Or the coal miners in Harlan County right now that are standing in front of a train loaded with coal and blocking it, because of wage theft. Those are wonderful stories. Those are happening all around us. And, when I think about I'm going back to the other question about Terni, is it a character? Is Austin a character in our lives, or is it just the place where we happen to live? And I think Austin is the place we happen to live now. For me, the fact that it's 200 miles from the Mexican border is very interesting. And I think, there are some very interesting struggles that are going on in Austin, right now. And I hesitate to name them because I think, a lot of the time when I show a film, people ask me, actually on this border series, why don't you just list some things that people could do at the bottom, right? Or when you show a film, they'll ask you, well, what would you have us do? And I kind of look at them and say, well, probably exactly what you're doing, because I think most people do have political lives that they're involved with that may not be electoral politics, and they may not think of it as being particularly life-changing. But I do think that that's the nature of our world, is that we're surrounded by class struggle. We're surrounded by people's movements, and they occur all around us all the time.
I think that's a really great way to sort of reframe how we think about it. And just maybe, it's a basic question, but one that is maybe helpful to think about, that this idea that there's some separation between us and these mass movements, this class struggle, this political struggle that is sort of just kind of seething through everything all the time, whether we realize it or not. I actually want to come back to something you mentioned with Portelli about this connection between Terni and Harlan County. And there's this aspect of this international working class that he sees himself as a part of that allows that connection to be made. And I'm wondering, for you, with your experience in Harlan County and everything else, how important do you think it is, or how much does it help us to make those connections or build those bridges precisely to other places that we may not be close to, like the teacher strikes in West Virginia? Because I'm incredibly inspired and trying to learn from them and figure out how to, if not be there physically right now, to learn from them and to see yourself as part of the same group, or the same group or mass that's trying to struggle towards a similar goal, maybe. But I guess I always wonder about this question of internationalism and how important that is, and how much that helps us bridge between locations and places in a way that is really vital and necessary.
Yeah, well, I mean, sometimes I fantasize, other people fantasize about the end of the world, and all of a sudden, they're going to be the one person that survives and stuff, and them and their family. But sometimes I fantasize that the rest of the world decides that U.S. imperialism has got to end. That's a good fantasy, isn't it?
That's mine.
And that somehow, they put a stop to us. Yeah. So when I think about solidarity across borders or something like that, which I think is a two-way street, you know what I mean? Even unions, sometimes their international relationships have been very, very awful.
Thinking about it.
Yeah. So I think in terms of understanding what's thinking of the world as a place full of comrades is a very good idea. And one of the things that was wonderful for me with Sandro's, an American studies guy. So he's very interested in the United States, and a lot of his friends are very interested in the United States, and has a deep love for people here, really, for working people here, and really a very deep understanding. I mean, I felt like, gosh, this guy knows more about people in my country than I do, you know? One of the things that I did with him, and because he functions as a cultural worker all the time, and one of the most interesting things that he does, he believes in audio recording. He doesn't believe in video recording. And the reason is, he says, audio recording is 360. So you go out to a field and you record somebody singing, or you go to a demonstration and you record somebody singing, you hear the context of the song. You hear everything that was going on around it. You hear that whole thing, where video, most of the time, is narrow, is focused in on the one subject. And, you know, and there are ways, you know, they're great DPs that deal with this and do context. But it's a very interesting idea. But anyway, while I was there, he was very interested in music, and particularly in music during demonstrations. And he always takes his recorder along to every demonstration, which I think is a really interesting idea. And I never go to a demonstration without taking pictures. I just don't, you know, I just think it's tremendously important to document if that's what you do. So he always takes his audio recorder and a good mic along with him. So I went and visited him. He brought me in to do a few showings of my film. It's the one time in my entire life that I've been invited. Last fall to Bologna. I thought he was saying that my work was Bologna at first, but it was an invitation to Bologna, which is like, I almost threw it away.
It's a good thing you read that.
Yeah. But anyway, so I got to spend time with him and his wife and we traveled quite a bit because I was screening. It was lovely. But what we did also was we went to demonstrations, and those were well, at the time, there was this mayor in southern Italy that had decided to accept migrants in from Africa. And there's a horrible fascistic minister of interior in Italy who then put him under house arrest while I was there. So there were these spontaneous, very large demonstrations in Rome in support of the migrants. And so I went to them with Sandro. And it was remarkable. It would do any leftist great good, because there were a lot of red flags with hammers and sickles. And then there were these beautiful older people, even older than me. I'm probably a lot of them my age. I don't know why I'm thinking of other people as older than I am, but who had dipped their hands in red paint and were holding their hands up, saying that our hands are bloody. So it was, and there were kids, and yeah, it was wonderful. And then this backdrop of these ancient ruins, you know, of the Colosseum and stuff like that. So it was intense and amazing, and really a way to be a cultural worker in the world. And I, of course, took some pictures and gave them to Sandro, and it just felt wonderful.
I'm curious, because you've mentioned a few times the idea of being a cultural worker, and just for anyone who's new to the show or just sort of here to learn, I'm wondering if you could just sort of talk more about what exactly that means for you and how you would describe that to somebody.
Well, I think it's a fairly common term these days. I suppose that it's a way of saying that culture, of course, belongs to the people. Art and culture are not forms for the elite. And so you call yourself a cultural worker because you're working, you're producing, you know, something. And you're not somehow magically inspired by the muse, you know, that you're inspired by reality and something material that's going on. Is that kind of helpful?
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm also wondering now, for, let's say, someone like myself, right, who's decided at some point not too long ago that I wanted to also get involved in making something, to being maybe some kind of cultural worker myself with trying to do this show. And I know that there's been a huge explosion in leftist media lately, in podcasts and, and maybe if it's very condensed, but videos on YouTube and things like this. And I'm curious, just with your history as a documentary filmmaker and with the idea of oral history, I guess what would your, words of wisdom or thoughts be for younger leftists on the importance of seeing us as cultural workers or being part of this and making this an active part of what we're doing as part of our political lives?
Oh, I think it's just essential. I mean, for one thing, it's kind of fun, right?
It's very fun.
I mean, I can't say it's like working in a factory, which I've done, or, a coal mine, which I haven't done, and I really get offended when people talk a lot about how hard their jobs are and stressful and blah, 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 and, how little money they make. And, it just bothers me. But I think it's kind of fun. I think it's a nice thing to do. Does it change the world, or is it kind of the tail behind the movement? And I kind of think of myself and my own work as being kind of behind the movement, not in front of it. What I like about the term, rather than a media maker, for example, is it puts you in a different kind of relationship, right? Yeah. So I think it's a good thing. I think it's very good for people to try to produce things that they care about. Just as you're not going to tell somebody not to paint a painting. If they feel like painting a painting, paint a painting, You want to go talk to somebody and record it and turn it into something, that's wonderful. You should do it. It's good for your own development. And it's a good thing to get out there. So I'm totally in approval, and I think does it substitute for what we've lost in journalism? And I'm not talking about, some of Cronkite on Vietnam was pretty damn good, but, and some of Murrow was really wonderful. And this idea of journalistic integrity, I think, is very important, not talk show stuff that we get now. So I think we've lost something too. And I don't think that people should just feel like they don't have to think, that they can just throw something up there and get something. And I'm not talking in terms of, I'm talking about doing it over a long time and trying to really make good work. I'm not talking about trying to be better than other people or trying to, win awards or something like that. I'm just saying I think it's important to try to make the work itself something that you feel proud of.
I really appreciate that too, because there's a way that this takes me back to talking about desire and imagination in our politics. And you talked about, if you want to paint a painting, paint the damn painting. And I think there's a way that in my own experience, just trying to do some very straightforward podcasts, focus on politics and all these other things. I used to be a musician in a former life, and I realized that there is a way that it's something deeply imaginative, it's something deeply artistic, and there's a desire to make the best thing possible, to create some sort of artistic thing, some object, some cultural object, even if it's a podcast that people download, and really trying to make something that you're proud of. Not again to be better than the other person to get more downloads, but do it because almost you feel that you have to. It feels that it's just part of your expression as a human being and as someone who has the politics that you have. So I'm not sure if you feel that way as well, but I will say that even just making a podcast, I feel that it does hit some artistic need and some desire that I have that feels very reminiscent of when I used to play and perform music all the time.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah, that I would totally agree with that. I believe in getting things out, and the more the better. There really isn't that much. We feel like there's a lot, but there isn't a lot of really, truly independent production going on the left. I think that's really important. I think what you're doing is important.
Just to return the sentiment, I think the work that you do is really important, and I was super excited for us to do this today because I'm kind of a fanboy of your work, and I think it's incredibly inspiring, and I feel really honored that you even agreed to be on the show and to be a part of this too. I'm curious, I don't want us to sort of lose the thread too much, and we're sort of coming up on about an hour and a half. Is there anything in Portelli or in the books that we haven't hit on that you wanted to make sure you get across to listeners to communicate like his vision or his work at this point?
Well, I think there's a tendency to not understand that academics and historians also have a class base. And so you don't go through the slog because you think, oh my God, this hasn't got anything to do with the stuff that I'm really interested in. But somebody like Portelli is always worth reading, even if he's writing for an academic audience, which he doesn't always. And it's because of his politics. It's not because he's also a brilliant man and a kind man and all of that. I think in terms of that one book, we did pretty well with it. Of course, there's a great deal more. I think he turns history upside down, looking at the lies. And I was actually thinking about that in the context of one of my union sisters. So one of the things, there was a big fight at the Communication Workers of America's convention around whether they would keep public sector unions. And you quoted some numbers. I think it's a little bit better in some ways and worse in some ways if you separate private from public. But public is going slightly down as well now. So unions are kind of in rough shape, but then you also have to think we're talking millions of people here. It's a very important movement still. It's the only real working class mass movement going right now. So it's it's important stuff. But anyway, so the CWA was thinking they would consolidate and and not have a public sector division. And one of my union sisters got up and she said basically, well, that's just like what the Nazis did to the Jews. Now, even me, with all of my caring about this thing, goes, what? Come on, right? But that's honestly what she was feeling at that moment. And why was she feeling that? And that's really the way we have to take something like that, is trying to really, and that's what Portelli's about. If somebody says something like that, maybe a little more profound or subtle, we have to understand where that's coming from, not just dismiss it as an exaggeration. Yeah. And certainly we've heard some things, particularly about police brutality, which there's that, come on, response. But we have to understand that people are really feeling those things. Or when a coal miner talks about Hillary Clinton's view of coal, again, rather than just dismissing it as somebody who's ignorant, we really have to begin trying to understand it. And that's, in a way, what Portelli gives me, is you pay attention when people say things, even if they seem like they're exaggerated. You try to understand the exaggeration. Or if something patently isn't true, let's try to understand why people are saying those things.
I think that's incredibly helpful to think about and incredibly powerful as maybe the lesson of Portelli's work, and I guess maybe oral history in general, is that it pushes us to have to make that leap to say, okay, this person has said this statement or this thing and it seems like an exaggeration, but we have to go beyond that and to think, where is this coming from? And it seems that we have to be able to really genuinely and curiously engage with that if we want to get behind what exactly is going on. So for me, I think it's something that has been some sort of vague feeling that I've had in politics and political organizing, is that the importance of that. But I guess what I find really interesting and didn't expect was how Portelli's work seems to really frame itself around what that could look like or how that looks and sounds and why it's so damn important. And I think maybe even more now, or at least to me, it feels more and more important every day because of how quick the divisions become very solidified, either between sectarian groups on the left or between different groups of just like masses of people out in rural areas and cities. And I mean, maybe it's a little bit of a sort of utopian notion, but it seems to me that the best political work and the best people that I've ever encountered find ways to do that. They find ways to have that genuine sort of curiosity. And it may seem like a small thing, but its impact seems fairly large to me. Maybe just to sort of wrap up, Anne is there, Comrade, and I should say everyone is Comrade on the show. But is there any sort of particular work of your own or anything for Portelli you could recommend people to check out if they want to learn more about you or to actually get into more depth with his work?
Okay, so with Portelli, I think people should just Google him, and they'll find some essays. They'll find, they can go on Amazon and see which of his books would be most relevant for them. But I would recommend beginning with just a Google search on Alessandro Portelli, and just take a look at what's there. With my work, there's the series on the border that's very artless, very transparent, no music, no visual effects, nothing like that. That's being published on the Rag blog. There are 6 of them. Well, by the time this comes out, there will be 6 of them. And that's all that there will be, but you can, again, find that material. It's called Asylum, Terror, and the Future, the series is. And so it's like 7-minute videos and a story with it, like a 2-minute read. It's mainly Jennifer Harbury's take on the border, so that I think is worth that time. And I would not do all of them at the same time. They're pretty intense. And so there's that. And then my latest film is A Strike and an Uprising. I now have DVDs. I'm going to be showing in San Antonio at the Indigenous Film Festival, and then in Houston at the Holocaust Museum, which is interesting. So I'm showing around, and if anybody is interested in a showing locally, I'd love to do it again here. I'm also spinning off a couple of shorts for kids in schools, one around Emetaneyuka and the pecan sheller strike, and the other around Annie Mae Carpenter and the uprising in Nacogdoches. And those will be 10 minutes for, well, I'm saying K through 12, but probably more in the middle range, middle to upper.
Yeah, that's great. And if you're okay with it, I'll put some links in the show notes to this episode so people can find those things. And I'll usually put some things related to any sort of references or historical aspects of what we talked about. But I guess on that note, Comrade Anne, I just want to say thanks for being on the show. And I really appreciate your work itself, and then also like sharing Portelli's work with all the listeners. Would you ever be interested to come back on and maybe do another book or another work that you think would be interesting?
I think we should trade it off. I should ask the questions and you should do that. Comrade. I love this idea, and I love the idea of a book too. I hope I didn't stray too much from that.
I think it was perfect, and it was actually right on par with how most episodes go. We sort of take it wherever it wants to. But yeah, maybe we can talk about something else to do for another episode soon. And I guess on that note, we'll bid adieu to all our Comrade listeners, and I guess we'll see you all next time. Peace.
Peace, Comrade.
All right, y'all. Another episode of Red Library is in the books. Big shout out. Huge thanks. Huge gratitude and appreciation to excellent Comrade Anne Lewis for joining us on the show this week. I hope you really enjoy getting to hear her history, her wisdom, her insights into Portelli, into the left, into being an active, thriving organizer and documentary filmmaker for quite some time now. Again, I've posted a lot of stuff in the show links, so really go check those out if you want to learn more about Comrade Ann and her work. I highly recommend it, and I think you will not be disappointed. And spread the word around. Share her work with others as well. Also, I hope you enjoyed the little musical break we had in the show. We're trying to get a little bit more creative here, and at that point in the episode, I just thought, we need something a little extra this week. We need a little bit of the anthem of the Italian Communist Party, the PCI, and it just seemed like the right thing to do. So every once in a while, we might try to sneak more of that stuff in there just to keep things interesting and freshen up the episodes a little bit. All right, y'all. We got lots more new guests, new content coming your way, so stay tuned to Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. In the meantime, please support the work we're doing in the following ways, in any sort of combination you so choose. Subscribe to the show on iTunes or any other podcast catcher you use. Give us a review on those podcast catchers with a number of stars, with a written review, post a meme, post a GIF, just write yeet a whole bunch of times over and over again. That's fine too. Head over to Patreon, throw us a few bucks if you want to support the work we're doing that way. We're working up to 25 patrons, trying to get some new gear, improve the quality of the show. And we're going to be pumping out some exclusive content to patrons coming up very, very soon, probably in the next month. So head over there if you'd like to get in on that. Like the page on Facebook, shoot us an email, let us know what you're thinking. If you have questions, follow us on Twitter. And last but not least, write scathing critiques of the show on your blog, or write out whole transcripts of the blog and then burn them and post pictures of you burning them on your Facebook. That's fine. That's pretty radical, right? All right, y'all. In the meantime, you know what to do. Keep dreaming, keep fighting, keep writing, keep talking to other people. Importantly, talk to other people. Talk to yourself. Let yourself know that, hey, you're doing okay. You're doing the best that you can. It's hard out there. It is not a sunshiny time that we find ourselves in, and that's why we need to stick even more closely together, to be more in solidarity with each other, to ask those hard questions, to have that critical reflection, to do that cultural work that Ann talked so much about, so beautifully, so eloquently on the show. And until the next time, Red Library out. Take care of yourselves, comrades. Peace.